Welcome, listeners, to the Running Mates podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Comstock. Thank you for joining us today. First, some quick programming notes. We've gotten a little bunched up in the holiday season with some scheduling conflicts, and so there will only be one episode for the month of December, and we'll try to pick back up to 2 episodes per month in 2026. Thank you for sticking with us. As you know, my name is Andrew, and I've worked in politics, electoral politics, for over 10 years in races in Georgia and California at the state, local, and federal level. I've also been in the political game in D.C. as well. This is my take on current events going on in D.C. and around the country, hoping to give people an inside look into the game of politics. In today's episode, we're going to be talking about an update on legislative moves regarding the Affordable Care Act credit extensions, an outlook for midterms around the country and here in Georgia. We're asking the question, is Trump a lame duck? What does that mean? And what would that look like for the next 3 years? And we're going to get into a little bit of Jeffery Epstein stuff. Finally, we'll end with predictions for 2026. So let's get started. So to briefly recap, the government shutdown, which was the longest government shutdown in American history, which lasted from October 1st to November 12th of this year, was ended ultimately by an agreement between Senate Republicans and Senate Democrats to hold a vote on extending the Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare or the ACA, funding credits into 2026. The agreement that ended this government shutdown was going to be a straight vote in the Senate onto whether or not they would extend these ACA credits. Ultimately, however, the R's had to eat this vote, and they voted down extending these credits. What that means is Democrats are going to be able to use the Republicans who voted no on extending your health care, helping their own constituents, against them in the upcoming election. Healthcare remains probably the best unifying message that Democrats will have going into 2026, aside from affordability. If the Democrats stick to healthcare, it's something that they've won on before, and it also unites the centrist and progressive wings of the Democrat Party. So there may be disagreements within the DNC about tackling affordability and how to go about making goods and services cheaper for people and making things better in this country. But something that people can agree on, at least in the short term, is extending or beefing up the ACA where possible. So now, not in the Senate, but in the House, 4 Republican House members have crossed party lines to push another vote in the House of Representatives that would give an ACA extension that would last another 3 years, so the rest of this presidential term. Now, what does this mean? So first, you can consider these ACA extensions as good as dead. So anything you see in the news, just understand that this is probably a foregone conclusion that healthcare costs are going to rise precipitously, at least through 2026. Even if this vote were to happen, or even if this legislation were to pass the House of Representatives, it would still go back to the Senate, which voted against it. So that Senate vote the Senate would have to retake a vote, and then Donald Trump it'd have to be signed by the president, all in the space of less than a week. So this is a purely symbolic move by these 4 vulnerable, moderate Republicans. 3 are from Pennsylvania, 1 is from New York. All are looking at re-election next year. And seeing a pretty big blue wave heading towards them. And they're trying to do something that they can go back to their constituents with and say to their voters, their Republican base, I don't like Obamacare, you don't like Obamacare, but we can't explode the system with these huge costs. This is better than nothing. And, letting these credits expire is going to put all this pressure onto the healthcare system writ large. And they can also go to more moderate Democrats in their district or swing voters and say, I'm not like these other Republicans. I want to help people lower healthcare costs. I want to build bridges and work together. So for these Republicans and everyone else who is up for re-election next year, it just shows that the reality of a D plus 12 or plus 12 Democrat advantage going into a standard ballot next year is a pretty steep cost for any Republican. So if you're a Republican and you didn't win your last election by, 15% or more, you might want to start polishing your resume and looking for work elsewhere. These 4 Republican defections to the Democrat side, in my opinion, also illustrate the weakness of the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, personally, as well as that position in general. I think we're about to speak as to whether Donald Trump is a lame duck. That is still to be determined, but I think it's pretty clear to say that Mike Johnson is a lame duck, that he can't whip his own party to maintain unity, even for symbolic votes. So for a symbolic vote on the Affordable Care Act, he's losing people left and right. Not to mention the big number of retirements and people leaving Congress. It just shows that at least during Johnson's speakership, all of the rumors that have been going out about what a toxic environment Capitol Hill is have been true. It seems that Mike Johnson in particular, he's so subservient to Donald Trump, and in our current world, the executive of the United States is in such a powerful position that what should be probably the most powerful elected position in government, the speakership of the House, that the guy may as well not even show up to work. I think in the future, in the grander scheme of things, once we get past this MAGA and Trumpism, one way that the pendulum might swing back and could be a positive outcome is if there was a more power given to or given back to the Speaker of the House, making it kind of an imperial speakership. There have been some good writers who've discussed this as a topic. If you look at previous parts of American history and then how government would work as the framers of the Constitution wanted it, the Speaker of the House should be an incredibly important, vital part of our nation in the management and drafting of new legislation. And slowly, unfortunately, many of the powers that position has had have been taken by the executive. So we're really towards the end of like a 50-year cycle of an imperial presidency where the chief executive, the president of the United States, is not really working with an equal partner as the Speaker of the House, the leader of the largest elected body, but is subservient to that person. So moving to Georgia, we have another very interesting and I think representative bit of information from a special election just this week on December 15th, where in a special election for Georgia House District 121, we had another flip. So another Democrat winning in a traditionally Republican area. I think it's really interesting to see how this election played out because I think it's representative of what's going on nationally and more of what we're going to be seeing next year. So District 121, it overlaps Athens, Clark County, and Oconee County. And what that means, Athens, Clark County, traditionally Democrat city, because University of Georgia is there. Oconee County is a suburb, traditionally very Republican. There was an election in this seat in 2024 that a Republican won by 60%. After redistricting, the strong Republican seat had some of its Republican areas merged into this district, 121. And so instead of being, Republican plus 15, it became Republican plus 7. The result of that is in 2024, when you had more of a generic ballot, the Republican won by 60%. That Republican retired this year, so there was a special election 1 year later in 2025. The Democrat won by 1%. So it was a very tight race. But here's where it gets very interesting. The Democrat who ran in 2024 and lost by 10 points was the same guy, Rick Geisler, who ran this year in 2025 and won by 1 point. So it was the same person, but the dynamics of the race changed. Now, it's important to note that this person, Eric, ran a campaign that was well-funded and very disciplined, and he ran on affordability. So he was sort of hitting all the right marks and topics for a candidate to make a big impact. But in 1 year's time, to have that 11% shift, it just shows you which way the winds are going in terms of these races. So if you're looking at this and trying to extrapolate, like look at what it means for the rest of the country, if you're a Republican up for next year, just as I said, things might not be looking too good right now. And it also sets up something of a disaster for these Republican attempts to gerrymander throughout the country, because you can't make new voters, but you can pull from your stronger districts and turn one strong district into two weak districts. And that could end up totally backfiring, at least in 2026. Now, that said, for anyone who's listening who's not in Georgia, Georgia has a very short legislative period. So the Georgia House and the Georgia Senate only meet for the first 4 months of the year from January to April. So in 2026, you can expect a lot more Georgia-focused content coming from me as we talk about what's going on in Georgia when the legislative cycle for the state really starts to heat up. So next, more of the, I would say, fun stuff or philosophical stuff to discuss that's in the news lately. First, is Trump a lame duck? Is he entering into his lame duck era? So I would argue yes, I believe that he is. Now, first, what is a lame duck? A lame duck is it's an older political term, which just means for a politician, usually a president who's in their second term and can't be reelected, is no longer relevant because they are not going to be on the ballot or they're in deadlock due to not having power to pass through their legislation. So it's usually when like a president or an elected official is sort of in the outgoing period between their election and when they're going to be replaced or when the next thing is going to happen. Originally, according to Google, it comes from Britain for indebted stockbrokers, later applied to politicians, suggesting that they're ineffective or unable to keep up. I think if you've been watching the news lately, it's very clear that Donald Trump has been ineffective and unable to keep up even with his own agenda. And this is just embodied by the pretty disastrous speech that he gave earlier this week, nominally on affordability in this country, but just became kind of a old man yells at sky rant and was not even worth listening to. We seem to be at a stage with Donald Trump as president and the people staffing in his administration where they just want to try and talk themselves and talk people out of doing what they're doing and feeling what they're feeling. What do I mean by that? I mean, the economy is anemic. The tariffs are unpopular. The polls show Donald Trump sinking further and further. The only solution that he seems to have is to get onto TV and try and talk his way out of things. It reminds me of like when you're at a big party and the police come and someone at the party says, no, I'll talk to the cops. I can get us out of this. Just let me talk. We'll be able to sneak by. And it never works. That's kind of the same vibe of his speech on Wednesday. It's like, no, the economy's doing great, everybody. Stop talking about it. Everything is going to be good and affordable. I'm lowering drug prices by 600%. Just clearly making things up, pulling things out of his hat, trying to throw whatever he can against the wall and see what sticks. In a larger sense, it's pretty clear that Trump is in his lame duck era because by the definition, he's not going to be seeking re-election in 2028. He's old. He's slowing down. He passed the most important thing for him, for the Republicans, for their donors, which is the one big beautiful bill, which is essentially just a big tax cut. It's the same thing that happened in Trump 1. Once that one bill is through, everyone else can just sort of ignore him and do whatever they were doing. And it seems like the walls are shrinking in for Donald Trump. He's still the president of the United States. He's still a very powerful guy. Usually when presidents get to this part of their tenure, they start thinking about their legacy. And you can see that in the stuff that he is doing on the news every day, trying to put his name on buildings, meddling in foreign policy, trying to give speeches on long-term topics. It'll be interesting to see how much further this spirals and if anyone else gets caught in the wake here. I think it's safe to say that he's going to as he says he's going to do, he'll be giving more and more speeches and holding more and more rallies, and he'll be getting crazier and crazier to try and hold people's attention for as long as possible. Trump has a unique ability to suck up all the oxygen around him and really steal the spotlight. So it'll be an opposition of forces of both people's attention to Donald Trump as he tries to do more things and get crazier and speak on bigger topics and do more, while the forces around him, the party around him, tries to move on. So speaking of the legacy of Donald Trump, that takes us to our final topic, which if you haven't been living under a rock, you've probably seen some stuff online or on the news about the Jeffery Epstein documents being released. They were released at 4 p.m. yesterday. So we're recording today, Saturday, December 20th. They were released 4 p.m. on Friday, the 19th. Those files are heavily redacted. There seems to be a continual dragging of feet to release more and more information. And it looks like this is the one topic that's not going to go away. It seems to be the one chink in the armor for Donald Trump specifically, that this conspiracy around Jeffrey Epstein, his human trafficking and sex crimes, and all of the many people who met with him or who were connected with him is just going to keep going. And the important thing politically that I see in this is when it comes to any kind of crime related to politics, it's usually not the crime itself, it's the cover-up. So that was the comment made about Watergate. And I think it applies here too. Specifically, the fact that Donald Trump is doing every single thing that he can to prevent or redact or deny any connection between himself and Jeffrey Epstein at great cost, at great personal cost, at great political cost, just tells me that there's something there. And, a lot of podcasts, a lot of very important people, and especially important journalists in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, others who are tracking this, you'll notice they'll continually try to downplay Jeffrey Epstein. And so, like, most recently, there's a really great New York Times article on Jeffrey Epstein, how he amassed his fortune. That was very good, but they sort of downplay this guy and say, well, he was kind of a con man. He was involved in a Ponzi scheme. He took advantage of wealthy clients and charged them exorbitant fees for services that weren't really quantifiable. And the more they try and contain this person who was very clearly the central hub of a big network of people who all knew what was going on, the more people are going to get interested and the more attention is going to stay on this topic. Speaking of which, what makes this a little different politically, as I said, it's sort of it seems like the one chink in the armor that Donald Trump is not able to just brush off like Teflon with all of the other outrageous things he says and does. And it's interesting that, and I should say, I'll put this in the show notes, but the two sponsors of the Jeffrey Epstein Accountability Act, bipartisan act by Ro Khanna on the Democrat side and Thomas Massie on the Republicans, passed into law in November and was the driving force behind this first release of documents, is very interesting. And both Thomas Massie and Ro Khanna in particular have said some very interesting things on this topic as well. Because this is official and it's a new law, it's not a congressional subpoena, it's not an inquiry or a FOIA request. This is going to continue on and on until all parties are satisfied with the release of as much information as possible. According to them, it should be everything other than the names and images of the victims. So the Jeffrey Epstein conspiracy is not going away. We're going to continue to know and learn more and more horrible things about that in the coming year. Other things I'm going to be looking to and interested in 2026 is there's a couple of things going through the Supreme Court currently, namely two questions. One over the Trump tariff regime, which will be very interesting to see how they handle it. Because on the one hand, they're not going to want to step on the toes of their benefactor, but on the other, if the tariffs are repealed or struck down on constitutional grounds, it may actually be a boon to the economy. So while I don't think Donald Trump's narcissistic ego can handle being told he's wrong or that he cannot do something, I do think, as I said earlier, kind of like a cornered animal, if given the opportunity to do something that would be thought of as popular or could help him, he will take it. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out in the Supreme Court and how the tariff regime itself continues in 2026. Oftentimes some people on the right, really buy into some of the cult of personality stuff from Donald Trump or from the Republican Party. And, they often use the term, if this is 4D chess. I have to say, if I was Donald Trump and I currently saw everything that was going on, I would probably declare victory and start lowering tariffs unilaterally with other countries, because that's probably the easiest way to bring the economy back into a better position and to lower inflation for average Americans. And it's funny because it's totally within his power to do so currently, but because he's implemented the tariffs in the first place, he seems to be stuck on keeping them and telling everyone he knows that it's actually the solution to all their problems. Second, from the Supreme Court, is the question of birthright citizenship. Most of the commentators I've seen have said that that's like a slam dunk, and birthright citizenship as a cornerstone of the United States and a part of the American identity will probably stay in place. But should that change, it would be a seismic shift, totally seismic shift in our country. And the fact that it's even being contemplated alone shows that a lot of the norms that we held very dear are being eroded from underneath us. And I think that feeling of institutions being brought to their breaking point and then breaking is kind of a theme for 2025, in my opinion. As we can see, the second Trump administration is far worse than the first Trump administration. Trump as a person seems unhinged and worse than before, and the people around him are simply less competent than the people in the first administration. So truly there are no more adults in the room anymore. But I would hate to end on a note of gloom on that, because I think For one thing, again, Trump seems to be in his lame duck era, and it looks like, the many things that he seems to be stuck on that seem to be priorities for him are all very easily reversible. The East Wing of the White House can be rebuilt exactly as it was. If he puts his name on the Kennedy Center in Washington, D.C., that can be removed very easily. And that's something I'd like to leave this episode with you, the listener. The pendulum swings one way or the other, but it always comes back. While there's many terrible things going on in this country currently, I do have hope for the future. And that's because many of the things that are being dismantled or eroded or abused, presidential powers, the destruction of USAID, the dismantling of the Department of Education, all of those things were good. The ending of the ACA, the gutting of Obamacare, all of those things were good, but they were not perfect. And in fact, if we go back to, say, 2012 or 14, many of those institutions were not looked upon fondly. I myself have been on Obamacare exchanges for years, and I was never a happy customer using them. So one way to think about everything that's going on is just that the worse this gets, or the more blatant the abuse and corruption gets, the stronger the response is needed to fix it. And I try and tell people who do get a little depressed about these things to think about the future and to say, well, there were a lot of problems at the Department of Education. There were a lot of problems at USAID. There were a lot of problems with the Emoluments Clause, and there were a lot of opportunities for graft and corruption from politicians. But we can fix that. The solutions are there. They can be implemented. And I think sooner than we believe, we may find that even better institutions or stronger guardrails can be enacted. In fact, unfortunately, if there's one takeaway from the Biden administration, it's that Joe Biden didn't do enough. He didn't go hard enough to protect the United States from this menace of nationalism and Trumpism and MAGA, America first, whatever. So whatever comes next, it will not be Joe Biden return to business as usual. That was an aberration. We can all move on. There's going to have to be some justice that's brought out, some reform to ensure that this kind of impunity doesn't happen again. And perhaps the newer versions of these institutions and organizations will be even better and will be better to serve the people and their mandates. So that's going to be it for me. Thank you so much for listening and tuning into the Running Mates. We do have a slate of very interesting people I'm excited to talk to and interview and share with you online. Appreciate your time joining us. I hope you may have learned something, and I hope that you have a wonderful holiday season. Please take care of yourself and take care of the people around you. Thanks. Bye-bye.